Before I begin, I want to remind you of something important. We all live different lives, and that's not a bad thing. It just means you can never truly understand what someone has been through until you step outside your own world. So, as you watch this and maybe later read the story itself, I want you to pause everything that is you and let these characters take you into their world. You know, and that's one of the most amazing things about being human. We can relate to each other on so many levels. A girl can explain a period to a man as feeling like food poisoning, but with blood, and he gets it, even though he will never experience it for himself. My name is Chukukere, and I recently published a short story titled "The Day I Die," a 40-minute interview with the closeted Nigerian gay man. Why did I write this? Because it's a story about shame, desire, guilt, and confusion colliding. You know, it's about religion, masculinity, and the unbearable silence so many people live in. And that's where you will find me as a writer, telling stories society tells us to avoid, as if ignoring them makes them, disappear. So I wanted to write something raw, something honest, something deeply Nigerian. A story that shows how the world forces people to be afraid of themselves, why religion and society pretend to be the saviors when they are the ones doing the harm. So where did the idea come from? Conversations. I'm an inquisitive person, and people tend to open up to me. So this story just grew out of one of those moments. So what's the story about? We meet Ade, a young Nigerian vlogger and podcaster, and he's hungry for viral moments. He's always looking for the next hot topic, and then he hits him. What could be more viral? What could get more clicks than a conversation about gaming in Nigeria? That was like instant fire. But then the next big question, how do I even find a gay man that is going to be willing to talk? It's not like they're walking around with tags on their heads. So Ade does what most people would do. He Googles. He finds an app called Boy Finder, and he goes undercover. He pretends to be gay, and he eventually finds a man who can hold a real conversation. And the man agrees to an interview under one condition: his identity must remain anonymous. Now, for a day, this was supposed to be content, get this man in, record, go viral. But what happens next is far deeper than anything anticipated. Let's start with Ade. He's the interviewer. So on the surface, he's confident, he's jolly, he's curious. He's the kind of guy you've definitely met before. He's the funny guy, he's the entertainer. But beneath that charm, Ade is conflicted. And during the interview, the more he talks, the more we see signs that he's hiding his own secrets, his own struggles. And that's the point, right? Ade isn't just one man, he's like a mirror. His character makes you stop and ask yourself, what parts of myself am I hiding to? Because the truth is, every one of us have had to shrink parts of ourselves at some point just to fit in. So I wanted Ade to represent, how most men live double lives and how society has trapped men with the rigid ideas of masculinity. And instead of breaking free from these expectations, many men just hide parts of themselves in secret, which brings me to masculinity itself. Define masculinity. No, I can't. I can't define you. I can only define myself. And I'm even still figuring that out, honestly. You know, Masculinity is too complex and too personal to be locked into one definition. But society acts like it owns men. Every day on social media, you hear what's happening to our men. Excuse me, who are your men? You didn't create a man. Even your son, your husband, your father is not your man. He's his own person. We say a man must do this, a man must do that. No, a man mustn't. Nobody must. What we should be teaching men, and everybody really is empathy. If men learned empathy, trust me, half of our problems could vanish overnight. Back to Ade. In Nigerian society, Ade is the kind of man who often enforces silence. He's the pastor, he's the husband, he's the policeman, and not necessarily violent, but complicit because he benefits from the system or he's too afraid to, challenge it. So I used Ade to remind us that even the gatekeepers of shame are often drowning in it themselves. And what this means is that, the Ade type person sets the tone for what is acceptable and shames people who don't fit in. But secretly, they suffer from the same or similar pressure. And that's what makes, him powerful as a character, because Ade is neither a villain or a hero. He doesn't attack the guy he's interviewing, but he represents the average Nigerian man, caught in his own contradictions. Holding the mic but not always knowing what to say, and that's dangerous empathy. You don't excuse Ade, but you understand him and you recognize him. You've met him, or maybe you're even him. Now let's talk about the anonymous gay man. And this story is told in first person. He's the narrator. He's smart, he's introspective, and he carries a quietness that comes from years of repression, pretending, and just wearing two faces. At one point, he admits that pretending is what made him quiet and controlled because he's afraid of what might come out if he gets too comfortable. So just imagine living like that, in a constant state of fear and anxiety, decade after decade, over something you can't change. I think it's enough to make anyone angry at the world. And I wanted this character to really capture exactly that. So society has made him hyper aware, always on edge, always scanning for danger. And you can see this in the interview because he notices everything happening around him. Ade's nervous body language, the bruises, the first scratches on Ade's arm, the mysterious phone calls Ade kept having, and even the bag thrown careless in the corner of the room. So to him, these weren't like random details. There were signs that something bigger was happening, and that level of perception, that survival instinct, that can only come from trauma. Now let's talk about the dynamic between the two characters, Ade, the interviewer, and the anonymous man. So at first the rules seem clear. The interviewee is the vulnerable one, and Ade is the playful, nonchalant host asking the questions. The interviewee sits quietly, laid back, and is almost cautious. Ade seems in control, and as the conversation unfolds, something fascinating starts to happen. The role starts to flip. The anonymous man starts seeing through Ade's facades. The nervous takes, the hypocrisy, the secrets hiding behind the laughter. And slowly his own voice grows firmer. It grows angrier, it becomes more unapologetic. He starts challenging Ade, he challenges society, he challenges himself. And this story isn't, about resolutions or happy endings. It's not liberation in the Hollywood sense. It's exposure. It asks a very uncomfortable question. Why are people so bothered by other people simply being who they are? If you're here from Instagram, you will know I asked my followers to send in questions, and nothing was off limits as long as it's connected to the story. And you guys didn't hold back. So yeah, a few of the ones I took. I know the story is centered in Nigeria. I'm white Canadian, but based in America. I've experienced homophobia too, but mostly from black folks. Why do you think it's worse with black men? Now, I don't know for a fact, but here's my take. I think it has to do with misogyny and the way we have been taught masculinity. I can't speak for all black men, but here in Nigeria, the average man is raised to think women are beneath him. It's cultural. And when you see femininity as weak and masculinity as superior, what happens when a man is seen as feminine? He gets treated with the same disdain, women face, or even worse. So when I spoke to both gay and straight men while preparing this story, I realized that most straight men think of gay men as the human in the relationship. They even ask stuff like, between two men, who's the human? And usually, what that means is, who's the more disgusting one? So everything in society looks down on women, weakness, inferiority, being less than, it all gets dumped on the gay man. But here's the difference, right? Straight men still want women for sex, but with gay men, they don't want anything from you. So the gay man becomes a sort of threat to their privilege, to their sacred masculinity. And yes, being a man today is still a privilege. Women, we enjoy it. And that's why so many men, make themselves gatekeepers of masculinity because it serves them. But let me quote directly from the anonymous man in my story. He said, I have a problem with how people talk about femininity as if it's a bad thing, even for women. Femininity doesn't equate weakness. And when it comes to men, it's not the same as being gay. I know straight men who are girly, and some of the most masculine men I've met are gay. There isn't one way of being gay or being anything. These things aren't black and white. And I'll just leave it here. But as a side note, I think this just shows why empathy is so important. Both black people and queers have faced systematic discrimination. Both have been told they are less than. Both have had to fight for their dignity. So if there's any group I expect the most empathy from, it should be the ones who know what, oppression feels like. So the next question, I enjoyed reading this thoroughly. It was almost impossible to pick a favorite part. And the whole thing read like it was written with tender carefulness. So I began to wonder, what was your favorite part to write? I think my favorite part was when the interviewee says people obsess over homosexuality even more than the Bible, and he asks why. Because the Bible speaks more clearly about greed, pride, injustice, and hypocrisy, and even gossip. But people pick what makes them powerful, what lets them point fingers and say, at least I'm not that. And he asks why. And this stood out to me because it highlights something many of us may not even be conscious of, you know. And it also reminded me of one of the interviews I did during the research phase. A man told me he had issues with gay men. His reason, morals. Okay. But here's the thing, right? This same man is also a proud prostitute and he sells sexually explicit videos. And I'm not judging that, but what struck me was the moral inconsistency, the sheer disconnection from reality. It's like when someone says, I don't smoke cigarettes, I smoke weed, as if one cancels the other, or I don't smoke but I drink, as if alcohol is suddenly a healthy drink. At some point, we just need to tell ourselves the truth, and it may be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Next question. This is a personal story. Go quit. Okay, first of all, no, this is not my personal story. And yes, writers often pull from real experiences, but it's usually not the parts you even assume. And go Queen. Queen where, bro? Queen Elizabeth. This colonialism. Didn't she pass away like 2 years ago? Okay. This guy doesn't watch the news apparently. Next question. We live in a society obsessed with giving people identities, even children. I saw a post the other day. A father bragged that he slapped his son for playing with a lipstick. A child. Children play with anything, so it means nothing until you sexualize it. And here's the truth, right? If your child is gay, there's nothing you can do about it. And instead of accepting that society chooses discrimination, but discrimination has consequences, these boys you beat into silence, they don't disappear. They grow into men with trauma, sadness, baggage. And guess what? Many of them marry your daughters, and then you wonder why marriages are collapsing these days. Gay men are not aliens. They are your fathers, they are your brothers, sons, husbands, best friends, and they're just hiding. And people often defend this with culture, but what's the point of culture if it doesn't serve life, joy, or human dignity? One of the men I interviewed married with a child, and from the outside, he seems happy, but in reality, he overworks himself to avoid intimacy. He gets home exhausted. So when, sex comes up, he's overworked, obviously. So when he can no longer avoid it, he takes Viagra and watches porn, and he says he imagines he's doing it with the man. And what kind of life is that for him, for the woman? That's prison. So my message to gay men, the world knows they are treating you unfairly, and you're like a distraction. You make their sins look smaller. Their hypocrisies, you make it look cleaner. But don't forget this, right? You have earned your place on this earth. You deserve to be here like everyone else. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, because nobody has life figured out. We are all just confused together. And yes, go learn karate if you must. Everyone else, here's an exercise. The next time you complain about how hard life is, ask yourself, who am I making life difficult for? Because most times we are each other's problems and we create the very difficulties we cry about. Finally, if you haven't read The Day I Die, please do. It's powerful, or at least that's what I've heard.